Good. I'm Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at the Pratt. Thanks for coming out on a rough night. It's like I was complaining to my wife 2 or 3 nights ago about how warm it was. Yeah. We're going to start in about 2 or 3 minutes. You're going to notice a couple more microphones, cameras in the back. That's because our good friends from C-SPAN are here tonight, and they're taping the program for later air. So I want to thank them for coming out. It also means it's extra important for you to direct your questions during the Q&A session to the microphone here, and then there'll be another one over to the right here. We also have an audience watching virtually, so they can't hear the question unless you use the mic, and it will help to the broadcasters when they re-air this, I guess, within the next month. Our good friends Urban Read Bookstore is here. They're selling books outside. If you haven't gotten a book, pick one up on the way out. Kerri will sign your book after the event. Kerri and Nikki will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes in discussion, and then we'll take your questions. And the other thing I want to add is if you didn't park in the Franklin Street garage in the future, make sure you do. We provide free parking now at Franklin Street after 4 p.m. for all of our author programs and all the programs that happen here at Central. So you walk in, you say, I parked at Franklin, I give you a voucher, free parking. And finally, I'd be remiss not to mention this. My colleague, Vivian Fisher, who is introducing this event and is the deputy chair of the library, today is her birthday. So I have to add that. She's going to be so mad at me. Anyway, we'll start in about a minute. Thanks again for coming out on a dreary night. All right.
Yeah. Okay, great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library. My name is Vivian Fisher, and I am Deputy Chief of the Pratt Library State Library Resource Center here at the Central Library. This evening, I am pleased to introduce our guest author, Kerri Greenidge, who will be in conversation with Dr. Nikki Taylor. Greenidge is the Mellon Assistant Professor in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonization, and Diaspora at Tufts University. She is the author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. Listed by the New York Times as one of its top picks of 2019, the book is the first biography of Boston editor William Monroe Trotter. Written in nearly 50 years, the book received the Mark Linton Prize in History, the Massachusetts Book Award, and numerous other awards. Black Radical was also shortlisted for the Stone Book Award from the Museum of African American History in Boston, and the Cundill History Prize, and the Pluchart Award for Best Biography. Greenidge received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University. In addition to Black Radical, she is author of The Grimkes, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family. Her writings have appeared in the Massachusetts Historical Review, the Radical History Review, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Guardian. At Tufts University, she also co-directs the African American Trail Project. Dr. Nikki Taylor is professor of history and chair of the Department of History at Howard University. She has published 4 books, one entitled Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women and Lethal Resistance to Slavery, which will be released in 2023. Please welcome Dr. Greenidge and Dr. Taylor.
Thank you. Dr. Greenidge, I loved this book. This book really was just so well done. And it really is timely. You know, it's just breathtaking research. It was just beautifully written. And I came away with such a respect for how you were able to weave together so many stories and biographies and places and ideologies. And so for those who don't know, I would hope that you would just start by telling us who the Grimkes are, who the family is, and why they matter to American history.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And before I get started, I just wanted to say that you were one of my intellectual idols. I read so many of your work when I was in graduate school, and so wonderful, wonderful. So thank you for being here. I always start by saying the Grimkes were, during the early 19th century, famous for the supposedly selfless act of the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, the daughter of one of the wealthiest slaveholding families in the antebellum South. Sarah and Angelina Grimke ended up leaving their home in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1820s to become anti-slavery and women's rights activists in Philadelphia. Their biggest claim to fame during the early 19th century was their public disavowal of slaveholding, as well as their belief that white women, and specifically white slaveholding women like themselves, had an obligation to fight against slavery in the South. In 1838, Angelina Grimke, the younger of the two sisters, spoke before the Massachusetts state legislature, becoming the first American-born woman to do so. She spoke out against slavery and the gag rule in Congress against slavery petitions, anti-slavery petitions, and she also spoke about the need for women to take an active role in politics. They intermarried, or Angelina intermarried, with Theodore Dwight Weld, who during the early 19th century was one of the most famous white male evangelical abolitionists, very famous for staging something called the Lane Rebellion at the Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, partnering with evangelical anti-slavery activists going throughout the burnt-over district in upstate New York and Ohio, founding schools, etc. So Angelina married Theodore Weld, and by 1840, Theodore Weld, Angelina Grimke Weld, and her sister Sarah Weld had retired to their home in New Jersey, where they opened up a series of schools that were very, very popular amongst abolitionists and reformers. So they educated the children of William Lloyd Garrison, for instance, the children of the Child family, Lydia Maria Child's family. And so that was the story that most people are taught about the Grimkes. A very famous biography was written about them in the early 1970s by the women's rights activist Gerda Lerner. And the story that is connected to that story, but is often missed by historians, or is categorized as somehow separate from the white story, is the story of the Grimke sisters' Black nephews. They came from a family, the Grimke sisters, of over 10 siblings. One of those siblings was named Henry F. Grimke, and he had 3 sons by an enslaved woman named Nancy Weston. 2 of those sons, Archibald Henry Grimke and Francis James Grimke, became phenomenal leaders and reformers, and the term at the time was race men during their time period. Archibald was a graduate of Harvard Law School and eventually became ambassador to what is now the Dominican Republic. And Francis was a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary and eventually became pastor of the most exclusive Black church in DC, the 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Archie married and had his own daughter, who became a famous playwright, author, literature of the early 20th century, Angelina Weld Grimke, who wrote and produced an anti-lynching play called Rachel, which appeared in the 19-teens. And so why this family is significant, that's sort of a mouthful to get into, right? Why this family is significant is that they illustrate, in my mind, the tension that Americans have between their slaveholding past and the implications that that has and that plays in the present. And the family also is a microcosm of how that legacy impacts African Americans and the ways that they relate to one another and the ways that they relate to politics, the way they understand Blackness, the way they understand their social obligations, and that legacy is twofold, right? It's the legacy of enslavement and the violence of enslavement, and the legacies of Black women who were sexually exploited and raped by white men, and the children and families that are produced from that. And what does that then do to Black consciousness and Black ideas about Blackness itself?
Thank you for that. I mean, and I really appreciated the fact that you brought those two sides of the same family together for the first time. And I think that is one of the things, that's one of your biggest contributions. There are a lot. There are multiple contributions that you make to several fields of history, but that is one of the ones that I appreciate the most. Can you tell us a little bit about your sources? Because I mean, I was just taken away by the depth and the details of your research. And I was like, where did she get this information from? I mean, you had conversations and both sides of letters. And so what were your main historical archival sources for this book?
Well, as I was telling you before, the biggest source was Moreland Spingarn at Howard University. Moreland Spingarn is a treasure in terms of the archival material they have on African American people, letters, family stories. A lot of what I was able to glean about the details about the Grimke brothers' enslavement came from Archibald Grimke's deathbed conversation with his daughter, which she wrote herself. So there's like, I think it's like 40 pages in her own hand of her writing as he's dying, and she's dating it every day that she's talking to him. And so Moreland Spingarn at Howard, shout out to Howard, was wonderful in that when I started doing research for the book, I took about 3 trips down there in person. And then of course, COVID hit. And I was, devastated that I wouldn't be able to finish the book. And I went down and I ended up getting the person there before they had to close scanned like hundreds and hundreds of pages for me to look at. So that was amazing. And Howard having just these boxes, of letters between the young Angelina and all of her friend circle. And then the letters between the brothers, and the letters between the brothers and their aunts, and the letters between all of the Grimke family contacts, and talking about their lives, and being able to really see in real time, sort of chronologically, the way that the Grimkes talked publicly about themselves, right? And then the very same day, because they wrote prolifically, talking privately about what they're really thinking about what they're writing publicly, which was fascinating, being able to see. So that was the main treasure trove. Thank you, Howard. Wonderful, wonderful. And then the Clements Library at the University of Michigan has the Grimke Weld family papers. And so that was literally going in and looking at every single letter that the Grimke women wrote, every single letter that their children wrote, every single letter that Angelina's daughter, Sarah, her husband, who became a pretty, prominent minister in the Midwest, all the letters he wrote to other ministries about his wife's family. So those two were the biggest sources. And of course, in Charleston, the records of the Avery Institute down there, and sort of the slave records in Charleston themselves. The white Grimke family, up until about 1815, when the father, John F. Grimke, got ill, kept meticulous records about their slaveholding and about the enslaved people in their house in relation to their own children. So they owned hundreds of slaves And what was amazing was the silences we were talking about before.
Mhm.
The way that they didn't name and talk about all the hundreds they enslaved, but the way they talked about enslaved people in their house and the relationship certain single enslaved people had with their own children. And that was very, very meticulously kept in a way that I hadn't seen in sort of other sources and slave records and sources. And so that was a huge, source as well.
Mhm. One of the things that the reasons why it's good that you brought these two sides of the family history together is that you talk about the Grimke sisters' activism, and you do such an amazing job of bringing in Black women abolitionists and their activism and being right there lockstep with the Grimke sisters. And so can you talk a little bit and share with the audience about Black women right there, people like Mariah Stewart and the Fortin sisters and the Purvis women, and how they were right there at the forefront in Philadelphia and beyond in the abolitionist struggle?
Yes. So one of the things that was immediately clear to me, both in my last book and just in terms of research for this book, was that the white Grimke sisters, when they arrived in Philadelphia, stepped into a world of Black activism that had been there for, going on 50, 60 years at the least, right?
Mhm.
In terms of recorded resistance. And the Black community, specifically in Philadelphia, had their own churches, they had their own anti-slavery societies, they were very militant in terms of their protecting one another from slave catchers coming into the city. And so when the white Grimke sisters came to Philadelphia, the letters and talks they would have amongst themselves about them kind of coming in and rescuing this Black community was disingenuous, to say the least, right? Because they're stepping into a community where the Black community had been doing that work for, decades. And one of the families was at the head of that was the Fortin family. James Fortin was a wealthy sailmaker, one of the wealthiest Black men in sort of the early American Republic. He has his own brood of children who lived in Philadelphia, and those children and him and his community are, protesting the American Colonization Society. They're rescuing fugitive slaves who make their way into Philadelphia and try to then go into the Pennsylvania countryside. They're meeting with the mayor when there's these series of violent riots against the Black community. And so when the Grimke sisters came to Philadelphia, they go to Quaker meetings, and their approach, the Grimke sisters' approach, was that they are coming in to rescue, right? The Black women's response to the Grimke sisters, specifically the Mapps Douglas family, which was a leading family, and the Fortin women and the Purvis women as well, were very adamant that the Grimke sisters were coming into a space that was already an activist space. And so I really wanted to ensure and point out that was where that was what gave the white Grimke sisters the audience for the activism that they were producing, because the Black community had already been doing it. And I also wanted to show that Francis James Grimke, one of the Grimke, white Grimke sisters' Black nephews, married into the Fortin family. His wife was Charlotte Fortin, who was the granddaughter of James Fortin. Charlotte Fortin was an extremely bright, sort of intellectually curious Black woman growing up in Philadelphia. Her mother had also been the product of a exploitative relationship between a white man and a Black woman in North Carolina. And so Charlotte Fortin was born, and she absorbs this Black activist tradition. And when she absorbs that, that's what informed Charlotte Fortin's own activism. She becomes the first Black woman to graduate from a state normal school, which was a teaching college in Salem, Massachusetts. She then became the first Black woman to write for the Atlantic Monthly. She goes down and she teaches freed people in the Sea Islands. And so I really wanted to say that and point out that, that's the root of the activism that is creating the possibilities for the abolition that the Grimke sisters embraced, right? Was the Black community, and specifically the Black women, who are creating that.
Right. And the Black women are also pushing the gender notions, right, about
Yes.
what women should and shouldn't be doing, right?
Exactly. And the Fortin women and Purvis women are pushing the limits of women's rights activism at the time, and also pushing the limits of of male public-facing activism
Yes.
at the time. And they're the ones who are, circulating the petitions that are going around to start schools. There's the ones who are creating, the Fortin women create a Black school that was like sort of a rival of Black public schools in the city of Philadelphia that are employing Black women teachers and educating this other generation, this new generation of Black free people. So I really wanted to ensure that one of the things that this book does is really places these communities and these actual Black people at the center of anti-slavery.
Right. So digging in a little bit, talked to you about this earlier, the colored elite.
Yes.
Okay. The Black elite, but at that time they were called the colored elite. Can you talk to us a little bit about how they became elite?
Yeah.
And what are some of their characteristics? What are their political commitments to the Black community? And how stable is this community in terms of their economic stability?
Well, one of the things that was fascinating, and there's been a lot of work done upon this, like Jacqueline Moore and all the people who have come before who have done work on the Black elite, Willard Gatewood. But I really wanted to delve into what is the human cost amongst a Black community that has always had a Black elite upper class, and yet how sustainable is that long term, given the long term effects of sort of a racial capitalist system in which Black people are actually the bodies that are encompassing the capitalist system, right? And so was it enough, for instance, for James Fortin to be this wealthy sailmaker who is raising his children to become artisans in Philadelphia? And then the economy changes and sailmaking and shipbuilding shift. And James Fortin, because he built his fortune himself, cannot rely like white sailmakers did on white family wealth. And so by the time he died, most of his money was gone, even though he had amassed, a huge fortune. And I found that kind of be carrying from, the early 19th century up into the early 20th century, this Black elite that had, at one point, and in some instances, an economic stake. They were comfortable. The Grimke brothers become economically comfortable in Washington, D.C. And yet the instability of that, given the racial economics of the American system, what does that actually mean in terms of the economic power and political power? And then how does that translate into how they relate to the Black masses of people who are not part of that elite? How they are created is complex, and each region of the country kind of emerges from a different genesis of kind of this Black elite. But one of the things I wanted to have in the book was this idea that much of this Black elite emerges from the 18th century sort of first generation of free people who managed to become free, but also the legacies of that being Black women who were sexually exploited, raped by white men, and the children who are produced by that, right? And then what does that actually mean to have, wealth? But wealth isn't just money, it's other things, right? Having money, having cachet, and then can you actually pass that on, right? And what does that actually look like in a family, right? Over a long period of time.
And the Fortins weren't, I was really shocked in the book to see what happened to their wealth. It was really shocking, the difficulties of holding on to Black wealth. But what about proximity to whiteness? What did they gain from having that proximity to whiteness, either genetic proximity or in terms of, even the two nephews' proximity to the Grimke sisters? What kind of advantages did it offer in a 19th century society?
So huge advantages. So the advantage is that the Grimke brothers, for instance, through their aunt. So the Grimke brothers are raised in Charleston. Their mother, Nancy Weston, is enslaved in Charleston until the end of the Civil War. Her sons, once their white father died, the Grimke white family basically cast Nancy Weston out to live by herself and support herself. So she's basically working, doing laundry. She's related to a free Black family, but she herself was not free. And so as she's raising her Black sons, she's raising them to believe in this colored elite, as she called them, the colored Westons, who are her relatives who are free. And when the Civil War ended, and of course I detail in the book kind of the brutality of their experience with their half-brother, and the boys are in their early teens. Nancy Weston, who herself could not read or write, makes sure that they attended the local freedmen's school, and through that the boys made their way to New England, eventually made their way to Lincoln University, and eventually became sort of astounding students who were written about in the National Anti-Slavery Standard. And that's when the white Grimke sisters read about them in the newspaper in 1868. The Grimke sisters saw their name, wrote to the boys asking, you know, are you related to this family? The boys said yes. And the Grimke sisters promised that they were going to assist them in any way that they could find. And so initially that proximity to the Grimke sisters was a very material boon for the Grimke brothers, because it ended up paying for them to finish at Lincoln. The Grimke sisters eventually pay for Archie to attend Harvard Law School, and eventually start this correspondence with the brothers about, you know, what schools they should apply to, where they should live, what career paths they could take, so kind of become mentors to them. And so that proximity in a material way at first is a positive thing. On the other side, the issue becomes, what do the Grimke sisters see in that relationship, given the way the Grimke sisters saw Black people, right? And so one of the things is that they, the way the Grimke sisters approached their mentorship, as they would have seen it, to their Black nephews, is constant criticism, right? Not accounting for the fact that the Grimke brothers were enslaved by their own family. So at one point, the Grimke brothers, their mother, Nancy Weston, was still in Charleston, right? Still working as a laundry person, still pretty poverty stricken. And the Grimke sisters never talk about helping her, right? And so the brothers are asking, well, what's going to happen to our mother? And their response is, well, you're lazy, right? You need to work harder, because, and you shouldn't be asking for your mother to come, because that's a lazy kind of way of being. And so their proximity to whiteness, on one hand, like many in their class, was giving them immediate material access. On the other hand, it was giving them, it was constantly judging them. It was constantly forcing them to choose between the loyalty and obligations that they had to their own mother and their own family, and then forcing them to kind of make a choice. And it was also, in a way, shaming them, because the truth was, where did they actually come from, right? They're very clearly the product of sexually coercive, it's a nice way of putting it, relationship between Henry and their mother that was tolerated by the family. And Henry was a notoriously violent person. And nobody ever talked about that, right? So then my concern in writing the history was sort of, well, what does that actually mean in day to day? How do they then react to other Black people who they've been told their whole lives that they're different from, right? How do they react when they end up sort of scaling these heights of success at the very same time that a majority of Black people are not, given the circumstances of Reconstruction and violence and segregation and all these things? How do they then relate to their obligations?
Exceptionalism.
Exceptional, right? Do they embrace that exceptionalism and say, well, no, we're Grimkes, which is what they tended to do. Or do they say, well, we're Grimkes, but we have an obligation because we're also Westons and we're also Black people who were victims of this system. And we understand that
enslaved past.
It was an enslaved past, right?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So then, you know, what was really disheartening was to see some of the same attitudes that the Grimke sisters had towards them. They then kind of mirrored those attitudes towards the masses, the darker complexion, lesser educated, poor masses of African Americans. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I found that the way that the Grimke brothers talked in their letters about the Black community that they very sincerely claimed to serve, much like their white aunts claimed to serve. So this was not saying, aha, gotcha. They were not actually sincere. They sincerely believed much like their white aunts, that what they are doing is they are race men. They use that term at the time, right? They are sacrificing themselves for the race. They're running a church nursery school. Archibald is working at the Westboro State Hospital for the Insane and ensuring that African-American patients can be admitted there. They're founding the NAACP. They're doing all these public things. And yet the way that they talked about and thought about Black people, the masses, and Black people who they referred to as, darker skin in these very disparaging terms, was that those people were less than. That those people were not like amongst the exceptional.
Right.
And that their job as the exceptional ones was to lift them up. And so it's kind of this enactment of what does kind of this idea of a talented 10th or racial uplift ideology, what can it actually mean if you're considering yourself as a Black person closer to kind of the white.
But what
whiteness.
was at the root of that? Was it purely color? Politics? Or was it a mixture of both?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think it was colorism. I think it was a mixture. It was this idea of respectability at all costs. So much so that there's these letters that go through between the brothers about criticizing Black DC because and
Naming Black Negro DC, as they called it. Of course, they themselves are Black, but accusing Negro DC of losing clout amongst white DC because too many of them don't present themselves well in public. And these are real conversations they're having amongst each other, and Frank is having with his congregation. And so it's colorism. It comes from the fact that their whole lives were built around, of necessity, Nancy was raising them to think of themselves as exceptional, because otherwise, how else was she supposed to raise them in the shadow of the Grimke family and the horrendous sort of circumstances in Charleston?
So what hope, if we look at somebody like the Grimke sisters and we see that, these are well-meaning, well-intentioned white women who are abolitionists, who have taken in their nephews, funded their education, really taken them into their homes, but yet they still harbored these deeply prejudiced ideas and sometimes even peddled in racist tropes and stereotypes. So what hope do we have for interracial alliances if we look at people like that and they failed at this project? I mean,
Yeah, I would say the hope, I think it comes from Black communities themselves, and that the work to be done by the Grimke sisters might have been to confront and challenge the violence that was occurring in their own home in a very real way, right? And so perhaps that was where the fight lay, right? Perhaps, it's sort of like back in the 60s when people would say, by 1965, 1966, Stokely Carmichael, perhaps white people going into their own communities and working with those communities where racism and the horrors of it lie. And the real sort of deliverance or hope for Black communities is embracing the entirety of the Black community itself and what that community actually needs and wants. And that might mean that it's not the people who are the heads of the churches or the heads of the school, the Black school board. It might be the actual majority of the people who are in the community. So I took that as the lesson. And that seemed to be the theme from like the 1820s up until the 1930s, was that when the Black community leaders looked to and talked to actual the majority of Black people in the community about what it is that they needed and wanted and, all of these things, that was where you could make a step forward, right? As opposed to dictating what those people want, right? Which is a very kind of paternalistic way of thinking, right?
Okay. And on the other hand, what about lessons that we might gather or gain as a Black community from the so-called colored elite in terms of activism, in terms of, reaching out to, other classes of our community, socioeconomic classes?
Yeah, I would say I think we need to understand that no amount of Black success, unfortunatately, is going to get us all out of out of racial mess, right?
Yes.
There's no, one of the things as I was writing this book was it was sort of like, oh, why can't we just talk about Black success? And,
Right.
so-and-so became the first Black billionaire. And as historically, just that hasn't delivered people from the mess of
It's
American
true.
racial capitalism,
Yeah.
right? That's never done good for the community historically. And so what might it mean to envision something different where we don't
Mhm.
make that the kind of the goal?
Mhm.
And we don't make that kind of a marker of success, right?
Mhm.
Because from a holistic standpoint and from a historical standpoint, that's not doing much, and it's actually pretty shallow. And as we see with the Grimkes, by the time they died, they definitely didn't have as much of the wealth
Right.
as they had at the beginning of the 1900s, not through any fault of their own. They can't. The economic times changed. Great Depression happens. The Grimkes survived that more than most Black people in DC, but that's a huge blow to like the Black middle and upper classes, and then slowly build it up again. And then we come to what, the 70s and 80s, same thing happens, and then 2008.
Yeah.
Same thing happens, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to sort of look beyond kind of this exceptional story.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you so much. We'll have time for the audience questions now.
If you have a question, could you please bring it to the microphone? Just stand up, like, if you are.
I know it's rainy and cold, so thank you for coming.
Hi, my name is Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think it's fantastic that you had access also to so much information and so many letters, because through history, we hear oftentimes about selective letters being destroyed and the ones that people want to have seen be seen. So based on everything that you got to see, if you were to take all of your knowledge and look at the Grimke sisters and paint a better picture of what they could have done, who they could have been, and I realize this is an opinion,
Yeah.
what would you think would have made them better and more effective to everyone?
Well, I think that in a way, the white Grimke sisters story, the question should be why and how that story has come to influence the way we ignore kind of the culpability of white slaveholding women within the institution of slavery. And so what could the Grimke sisters have done? I mean, I go back to what would it have meant if the Grimke sisters, when they went to Philadelphia, responded when there's a huge anti-Black riot right outside their door, 3 blocks from where they lived. And they never talked about any of that, right? So what would it have meant if that was where they started their activism? And many of the people who were rioting were people they knew, right? Who were going in and tearing down Black neighborhoods and burning down. I mean, what would that have meant if that's where they began from? What would it have meant if there's stories of enslaved people in their household, and the Grimke sisters dislike slavery, obviously, right? Very sincere in that. But what would it have meant if, when they went to Philadelphia, there was some process by which they tried to help relieve the hundreds of people who were still enslaved, who they saw being horribly, and if you count one of the images in the book, being horribly disfigured and abused in their own household, right? What would that have actually looked like? I think part of what tends to happen is that activists, particularly anti-slavery activists at the time, tended to see Black people not as people, but as victims, and as a means to an end in terms of redemption and reform. And so what would it have meant if they actually said, we were slaveholding white women, we're coming to Philadelphia, one of the Blackest cities in the country at the time. So it's not as if they're coming into a space where they don't know there's Black people who are free. And actually said, well, what does the Black community actually want, right? As opposed to, and listening to the Black women who they see all the time, and they go to Quaker meeting with one of the women who is segregated in the back, and the Grimke sisters have no response, right, to that kind of circumstance, even as they're writing their amazing treatises, right? What would it have meant if they responded to that? So I think that that's where the Grimke sisters disconnect comes from, and the disconnect of many within their own class came from, was that they were very very eager to encounter Black people as victims, as that famous daguerreotype that was made in the 1830s. You know, am I a slave and a brother with the hands upraised? That's a very comforting image in a way. But what happens when Black people come into the room and they have opinions of their own, and they want to start their own schools with their own curriculum, right? And they say, no, 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 it's not strategic to us. It's actually a real process of liberation, right? That would have looked totally different, right? If that had been the approach, as opposed to concentrating on the redemption of themselves and white women, which is where originally a lot of their anti-slavery thought came from.
My name is Jeffrey. That was a fabulous talk, and I look forward to reading the book. I could have liked to ask two questions. The first has to do, mention was made of Black abolitionist women, and Baltimore's own Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Was there any connection between the Grimkes and Frances Harper?
Go ahead.
Secondly, just to get that in, then I'll sit. This has to do more with the Grimke brothers. Where would they have come down in the 1890s and 1900s in the whole struggle between Booker Washington and the more accommodationist policy he was advocating, and W.E.B. Du Bois and the more activist radical policy he was advocating for advancing Black civil rights? Where would the Grimke brothers have come down in that whole, in the larger political debate going on in the Black community?
Well, thank you for your question, and good question. So Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the Fortin family were phenomenal organizers of abolition. So they knew Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. They knew her uncle, Watkins, who was an activist both in Baltimore and then helped sell Black newspapers in Philadelphia as well. So they knew each other. How sort of deeply like the friendship came, I didn't find evidence of that, but they definitely knew each other. They went to the same anti-slavery meetings. They corresponded with one another. Charlotte Fortin, once she went to Salem, actually read and corresponded with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was, you know, the premier Black poet at the time. So a big connection between the two. So the Grimke brothers were both, well, first of all, Archibald Grimke was friends with the person I wrote my first book about, which was William Monroe Trotter in Boston. Archibald Grimke was a political independent, so he was one of the first to advocate that Black people needed to vote race, not party, was kind of the slogan at the time, and not be beholden and tied to the Republican Party. Ended up voting and organizing Black Northerners around the Democratic Party, and that's how he got his position in the Cleveland administration. Through that, he was friends with Du Bois, but he was also friends and in contact with Booker T. Washington. In the book, I sort of point out that dichotomy and that separation that we tend to think of between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois was not kind of this rivalry that we think of as like loggerheads. They never the twain shall meet. They didn't talk to each other. They did talk to each other, all of the sort of schools of Black thought within this moment, except for Trotter, who I wrote about in my first book, right? Who had he was a radical at the time. But all of these people talked and conversed with one another. By the time you got to 1905 and 1906 with the Brownsville incident in Texas, many members of the Black elite began to question Booker T. Washington's allegiance to accommodationism and his public-facing accommodationism. By this point, Archie had been helping Booker T. Washington facilitate scholarship programs for Tuskegee. So even though publicly Archie was critical of Booker T. Washington and also critical of Du Bois and some, behind the scenes, they're all working together, right? In terms of this group of elite Black people that I talk about. So that kind of that being some type of contest or disagreement between them was not as pronounced as, say, in another community like in Boston, which I covered, which was there. That was a huge issue, was between Booker T. Washington and the Black community. But in DC and in this particular community, Archie was friendly with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington attended services at 15th Street Presbyterian often when he came to DC, and stayed with Francis Grimke often when he visited the city, even though Francis Grimke advocated for the NAACP. So that's kind of a fascinating thing that, you know, I talk about both in this book and the last book, was kind of the ways that what we think of as being these two camps were in constant conversation with one another.
Good evening. Thank you for doing the difficult research to bring about such an interesting book. I had two questions. I first heard of Mr. Archibald Grimke when I was reading the book White Lies about Walter Francis White and the NAACP. I wanted to know, did you ever find research or data that the Grimke sisters had any kind of interaction with Harriet Tubman or William Still? And what came about there, if there was any findings there? And I also wanted to know, how come the Grimke brothers had the name Grimke instead of their mother's last name?
So, that's an interesting question. So Nancy Weston, according to her son, so Nancy Weston could neither read nor write. So I always preface that this is according to her son's recollection and recollection of family members who were the Westons, was that Nancy was adamant that her sons were colored Westons, as she called them, so that's her free family, but that they were Grimkes as well. And there's a lot of sort of historians who have done a lot of work on that. There's a book by Tracker Barty Myers that's called Forging Freedom. That's about free Black women in Charleston and how they kind of negotiated their lives within this sort of very racially and sexually violent Charleston at the time. And so she was somebody, or Nancy was somebody who definitely saw around her, particularly in her own family, Black women who had managed to become free or negotiate freedom through their relationships with white men. Her own sister, Lydia, had sons with a family called the Cardozo family. And the Cardozo family were a slaveholding family, but they sent the Black women they had children with to the north. And so that meant that those women and children lived free, right? Even if they weren't legally free. And so all of this to me, when I was sort of piecing back why she would call her children Grimke, was that she was concerned with and grew up and lived in a world of Charleston in which the possibility of claiming the Grimke name, there was a possibility in this world of Charleston at the time that they could become like the Cardozos, in which the white father eventually realized that he had these sons, that they were getting older, and he sent them north, right? And those sons then had a different life than living in Charleston. Henry Grimke didn't do that, right? We know he didn't do that. We know, given all the evidence, that he probably wasn't capable of doing that. But as a mother with 3 sons, and one of the things I found heartbreaking about Nancy Weston was that she had a child before, and that child, she was sold with that child. And we don't know what happened to that child, right? And so given that fact, just as a mother, what do you tell your sons who are living and existing in this world where their cousins, right, are actually living as free, and some of them end up going north, and they have white fathers, right? What do you tell them? You might, as a parent, right? Again, this is speculation, but given the evidence, you know, it's a pretty, you know, I would say it's a pretty accurate one, right? Mm-hmm. Could be that, you know, you're giving your children these hopes and the idea that they can escape what they're in, right? And so the Grimke brothers, by the time they got to Lincoln, they were, everyone by all accounts were, you know, very proud, very well read. I hate using that term, but you know, they could read, they could write, they could recite. They were, you know, Southern little gentlemen, which is what she wanted them to be, so that they could at least imagine something beyond their circumstances. And so she succeeded in that. They were Grimkes, but you know, part of the legacy, part of the book is like, well, what's the legacy of that, right? How actually free were they when we know they actually weren't free until the end of the Civil War?
I wanted to know if there was a connection with the Grimke sisters
Mm-hmm.
and Harriet Tubman, since she was in Philadelphia also, and William Still and the other abolitionists that were in Philadelphia at that time?
So William Still was good friends with the Fortons or with the Purvises, who were intermarried with the Fortons. The White Grimke sisters, except for 3 of the Forton women, didn't have a lot of contact with Black abolitionist people like in the field. And by the 1839, 1840, they are, for all intents and purposes, retired from the public because Angelina had children. And she had very, very trying pregnancies. And so basically lived in New Jersey with her sister Sarah, had her own children, was raising her children. And so the Grimke sisters, I would say, were still involved with abolitionist circles. They still talked to, Harry Beecher Stowe and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were educating those people's children in their house, in their school, and they had some of the descendants of the Still family as Black students in their school. Their school was integrated. But in terms of like a relationship, in terms of activism and abolition with, say, the Stills and the other Black abolitionists, Harriet Tubman, there's nothing specific like them having a specific relationship with them by the time you get to the 1840s and 1850s.
Are there any other questions? Thank you for this remarkable work, and I can't wait to read it. Let's give Kerri and Nikki a warm welcome.
Thank you.
So Kerri will be signing books out in the hallway, so please go out and purchase your books. And we have several upcoming programs, so please get a copy of the Compass newsletter to look at all our wonderful programs that we have upcoming. Again, thank you so much, and good luck on your book tour.
Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
Can you sign that?
Of course.